Hello again and welcome. I'm Michael Corcoran. I'm currently serving as the president of Land Heritage Coalition of Glastonbury. Welcome to the Seeing Through the Forest Through the Trees series. Tonight's third and final installment is Connecticut Forests and Climate Change. Just a brief note, just kind of why it is that we presented this and why we feel it's important. We've done several installments here. The name, Seeing the Forest Through the Trees, kind of defining what a forest is beyond trees. Is it more than an assemblance of trees? And I think we've learned to this point that it certainly is, that it is comprised of all kinds of different organisms that are working together in synergy to produce this really kind of impressive biological machine that provides for us all in the way of ecosystem services. It takes carbon dioxide out of the air and gives us the air we breathe. It regulates the water cycle, filters our water, retains stormwater, runs the water cycle. It moderates our temperature. Those are some pretty big things out of one little machine or one big machine. And it's a global thing. We entitled tonight Connecticut's Forest, but it's a global machine. In Connecticut, we have several different forest types, but if you look globally, there's the boreal forests in the Arctic, there's the tropical forests along the equator, and they're all performing those functions for us quietly but surely. The subject of forests has come to the forefront with more and more talk about climate change. A decisive issue for some. We've called a spade tonight. I've noticed that the verbiage on a lot of presentations have tried to get around those two words, co-joined, to try and stay away from controversy. But the data dictates that we're dealing with climate change. And obviously fossil fuel emissions are a big part of that and reducing those, but we're also looking to our forests as a way of mitigating it. And it's asking a lot. We're already taking a lot from our forests. And personally, if I were our forests, I'd be saying, you know what, I've got my own problems. I've got diseases, pests, and pathogens that I'm dealing with. I've got invasive plants. You're asking more and more of me. They need our help. And I think that's where this trend towards ecological forest management comes in. And our first presenter, Ethan Tapper, touched on that. I don't want to go on at length. I've got two great experts lined up to talk tonight. And but I do want to say there are examples of this ecological forestry in our own backyard. I would encourage anyone to go and look up the Mishomisik forest plan prepared by Nathan Piche. And look at it. It's pretty approachable in layman's terms. And then if you go back to Ethan Tapper up in Vermont, who was our first presenter, he wrote the forest plan for the community forest, Andrews Community Forest in Richmond, Vermont. And it was an education for me, looking at how they're balancing sensitive ecosystems, recreational use, and forest products, so that all of these things are covered, but giving the priority to ecology, given the importance of our forest ecosystems. With that being said, I'll yield to the experts. For those of you that can see Danica and Andrea on screen, Danica Dorosky is screen left. She is the Connecticut DEP, thank you, Urban Forestry Coordinator for the state of Connecticut. And to the right, we have Andrea Urbano, who is our regional service forester for the central part of the state, which includes Glastonbury. That being said, ladies, thank you very much for taking the time to address us tonight, and I will yield the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for having us and for all of your participation and interest. I'm going to turn off our screen while we talk to ensure that we get the most clear use of our microphone. But with no further ado, let's get going.
we were trying to make our life easier by presenting from the same room, but in fact made our life a little bit harder because we could not share a microphone. So apologies for the awkwardness of this. Anyway, so as Michael said, we're going to be presenting on Connecticut forests and climate change along an urban and rural gradient. So talking about our urban forests and our woodlands.
Okay, so here we can see, hold on one second. Okay, a basic overview of Connecticut's forest resource. Here you can see our land cover, and that our state is approximately 55% forested, which equates to about 1.8 million acres of forest land. The forest land you see in green represents the more traditional woodlot rural landscape, the type of woods that I interact with as a professional. However, as Danica will discuss, the purple or developed land contains much of the state's urban forest resource. Here we can see a breakdown of the ownership of forest land ownership in Connecticut and relative to our regional neighbors. Connecticut is outlined in red. Interestingly, the vast majority of our forest land, approximately 71%, is privately owned by folks like you. The state of Connecticut owns the next largest portion of Connecticut's forest land cover, which is approximately 13%. And municipalities like that of Glastonbury own approximately 3% of Connecticut's forested landscape. So this tells us that stewardship of our forest resource requires collaboration and support from multiple sectors. And it also informs us of a great need to educate, support, and provide technical assistance to private landowners statewide. And that's largely what Danica and I are tasked with as professionals of the Division of Forestry.
And so as Andrea pointed out, we have a matrix of developed and forested landscapes across Connecticut. The purple areas are indicating the developed landscape. But here what I've done is I've zoomed in on the land cover in Glastonbury, and what you can see that even in a highly developed area like, the Hartford, Glastonbury area, when you zoom in, what you can see is that we have lots and lots of tree cover that's existing within this developed matrix. So all of the green that you see in this blown up image is tree cover, whether those are trees in people's backyards, along the roadsides, or in parked areas. So, giving a little context for what a forested landscape looks like in our state, we now want to kind of zoom out and talk a little bit about what is climate change. I think probably everyone in this talk has some level of familiarity. The atmosphere traps heat that's radiating from the Earth towards space, creating this greenhouse gas effect. And this is largely the result of increased CO2 emissions, which is the biggest contributor to climate change. So you can see from this map, carbon dioxide has fluctuated over time, but never have we seen level like we have seen in the last several decades since the 1950s. And this is causing all sorts of different impacts throughout New England. We're seeing things like elevated temperatures, longer growing seasons, changes in our precipitation patterns, more droughts and heat waves. We're seeing more intense and frequent storm events, and we're seeing sea level rise.
Okay, so all of what Danica just listed as the impacts of climate change are being experienced across the globe, but they each have seasonal and varied localized effects. So the data we're looking at now is specific to Connecticut. And similar to the global trend, temperatures in Connecticut have risen. However, they've risen 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit since the beginning of the century, which is about 1 degree higher than the global average, which is about 2.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Like the global average, however, Connecticut air temperatures have the potential to increase another 3 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. And this potential depends on the emissions and current and future human activity. So here you see Connecticut's observed and projected changes in air temperature. Observed data is represented in that orange line, and it spans from about 1900 to about 2014. And expected changes are projected out to 2100 and are based on 2 global climate model scenarios, a higher emission scenario and a lower emission scenario, the higher being red and the lower being green. And so, as you can see by the orange line, over time, Connecticut's temperatures have increased 3.5 degrees and have the potential, if we're in the lower emissions scenario, the less warming is expected, it may increase yet another 3 degrees. And in the greater higher emission scenario where greater warming is expected, the hottest years may be about 10 degrees warmer than the hottest year in the historical record, which you see in that gray blob. So though Connecticut's temperature has risen at 3.5 degrees since the beginning of the 20th century, that doesn't mean that every day or every month or every season is on average 3.5 degrees warmer. There's a disproportionate warming occurring in winter. Here you see data collected through a professor and researcher, Pamela Templer of BU. I put English conversions where appropriate because it is like most scientific literature in the metric system. We don't have comparisons, or at least not in this presentation, to spring and summer temperatures, but this shows and depicts the trend of winter warming in the US Northeast. This is not specific to Connecticut. The 2 degrees Celsius increase since the 1950s is equivalent to over 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is having seasonal effects in Connecticut. Now, many scientists have debated whether the observed and projected increase in air temperatures will increase forest productivity. And that's just another word for forest growth, or limit it. It's been debated. And indeed, the warmer winter temperatures extend our growing season. So on the one hand, there is a longer time for plants to photosynthesize, which can mean greater growth rates and carbon sequestration rates. However, on the other hand, scientists are finding that these benefits can be and in fact are offset by increased respiration associated with warmer temperatures. Forest plants are also more vulnerable to late spring frosts and impacts from soil frosts, which can reduce productivity or tree growth. Here you're seeing another climate model projection of changes in spring precipitation. This is projected out to the middle of the 21st century and it's all relative to the late 20th century, and it's under a higher emissions pathway. These data are specific to Connecticut, as the image indicates. But depending on where you are in the state, spring precipitation is projected to increase by 5% all the way up to 15%. And that hatching you're seeing throughout most of northern United States and all of Connecticut indicates a statistically significant change in springtime precipitation. So let's put that into context, okay? What this means for our forests. So Connecticut currently receives an average of 45 inches of rainfall a year. Based on these projections, Connecticut will have an average rainfall of between 47.25 inches to a little above 51 inches of rainfall per year, depending on location. This in itself is not alarming, but let's think about it in the context of the gallons of water per acre each inch of rain provides. So 1 inch of rain equates to over 27,000 gallons of water per acre, which is equivalent to about 13 tons of water per acre. So currently, our forests and landscape take in and process a 1.25 million gallons of precipitation per acre. And this has the potential to increase by these numbers you see reported here up to about 1.4 million gallons per acre. And we care about this because, as we're both going to discuss later, our rain is falling in these intense events relative to the past, and it's a lot of precipitation for one system to process at any one time. So this has serious consequences for our forest's ability to be able to slow down the rate of water, filter it, reduce erosion, provide flood control benefits, etc. There are also changes in winter-spring precipitation patterns throughout the Northeast. Here's more data from Pamela Templer. And really, what this is telling us is that we're having less snowfall in the winter and more rain, which makes sense because of how much more our winters have warmed. And what she found is that there are, compared to 1950, we have an average of 20 fewer days of snow cover per winter, and our maximum snowpack is on average 10 inches less than it used to be. Now, you may think, how nice, less snow removal and maintenance to deal with. And that may be true, but this has negative impacts on our forests. Let's discuss. So on the left, you see a depiction of a forest with adequate snow cover. That's that white block above the root zone. And on the right, in our warming climate, there's no snow cover, and instead you see soil frost penetrating into the root zone. Those are those white triangles you see. So snow acts as insulation. And with a lack of this insulation, we are observing damaged biota in our forests. It's damaging roots, it's affecting microbial populations and populations of arthropods. And this is leading to projected and current decreases in air and water quality. And they actually found that the potential of carbon storage throughout the Northeast can be reduced by up to 15% as a result of this one dynamic, the lack of snow cover. We're also, so though the intensity of precipitation events are increasing, Connecticut is also experiencing extended periods of dryness in between these extreme weather events. Drought is certainly playing a greater role across Connecticut's landscape, as I'm sure you've all observed and experienced in recent years. So here you see data from the U.S. Drought Monitor spanning from a recent, 19-year stretch of time. The D0 to D4s are classifications that indicate the duration of the drought, with the D4 drought being the longest duration. And so what you're seeing represented here is that the longest duration of drought in Connecticut lasted 46 weeks, almost a full year, beginning in late June 2016, ending early May 2017. And the most intense period of drought occurred the week of November 15th in 2016, where a D3 drought affected almost 45% of Connecticut's land. So droughts are among the greatest stressors on forested ecosystems. They often lead to secondary effects of insects and disease outbreaks on stressed trees and increased fire risk. We're witnessing an example of this present day in eastern Connecticut and pockets of western Connecticut, with gypsy moth and two-line chestnut borer following some consecutive years of drought. I meant, oh, this is
Okay, so another thing that we're observing, as we mentioned in the previous slide, is more intense and more frequent storm events, and that's something that we're observing year by year with the increase in hurricanes and intensity of summer hurricanes. And we're also observing sea level rise. And this is really important in Connecticut because we are a state with a lot of coastline, and particularly in an urban context, a lot of our major cities are located along the coast. And so sea level rise has major implications for the forests in these cities. In Connecticut, sea level has risen 10 to 12 centimeters in the last century, which is faster than the global rate. And so current projections are expecting 1 to 4 feet by 2010 just in Connecticut. 2100. Sorry, didn't mean to scare everyone. So we want to talk a little bit now about where does the forest come into this? We've talked a lot about the climate, the stressors of climate change. What role do forests and trees play in this? And so, forests and trees are a really critical form of nature-based climate solutions. And so that means that's a way that we can harness sort of nature to actually combat climate change and its impacts. And trees and forests are a really effective form of these nature-based climate solutions because they're able to store and sequester carbon.
So let's define those terms, which are often used interchangeably but mean two distinct things. So carbon sequestration is the process of removing atmospheric carbon for use in photosynthesis. It results in the maintenance and growth of plants and trees. It's expressed as a rate and tends to be greatest in younger trees and forests, which makes sense. Just like humans, they grow faster, younger trees. And carbon storage is the amount of carbon retained in wood, soil, and other carbon pools, like those depicted in this schematic. Let's take a second to break this down, but I will mention carbon storage tends to be greatest in older trees and forests, but most importantly, carbon storage is greatest in forests that are structurally complex, meaning, well, I'll talk about that later, but that addresses the size, arrangement, and spacing of trees in a forested system. So here are the main carbon storage pools of a forested system. You have live above ground biomass, so live trees, shrubs. You have below ground live biomass, so the roots that correspond to the live above ground. There's litter, which are leaves and fine branches that fall and build up on top of the soil, or its organic matter. There's dead wood is an important carbon storage pool, and soil. which is another below ground pool of carbon and arguably the largest carbon storage pool in the forested system. Now, you're seeing a bunch of arrows moving to and from these pools. And what this indicates is that, like everything in ecology, nothing is static, everything is dynamic. And the carbon stored in one pool is only there really temporarily. It transfers from live to dead, or from live to litter, from dead to soil, etc. There's also another really important pool of carbon that is harvested wood products. There are net losses of carbon when converting a tree into a wood product, but this is a really important consideration in the value forests and wood products play in mitigating the effects of climate change. We can break these pools down even further, like into sequestration and storage categories, as you see in these pie charts. And you can see the live biomass is doing most of the sequestration, which makes sense because that's where photosynthesis happens in plant foliage. And in storage, above ground biomass is the second largest pool of carbon. We will expect the dead wood pool to increase over time.
And so regardless of whether these trees are growing in our downtown centers or in woodlands, they have the capacity to store and sequester carbon. And so that really is the premise of this talk and this conversation, because, you know, across urban and rural landscapes, trees and forests are this valuable climate change tool, but the management of these different types of forests really is going to depend on the context, so where they're growing, whether they're in a city or in more of a woodland area. So I'm going to spend the next few slides talking specifically about what climate change means in the context of our urban forests, how climate change is impacting our cities, and how we can manage our forests better in cities with climate change in mind. So, you know, cities are especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. One reason for this is the urban heat island effect, which some of you may be familiar with already, which basically just says that urban areas can be significantly hotter than surrounding rural areas because there is so much impervious surface, because there is limited green space and more pervious area. As you can see this chart that's showing you afternoon temperatures in rural areas compared with the downtown area, and there's these significant differences in heat. And in fact, in Hartford, we have data that demonstrates that the city of Hartford can be up to 19 degrees hotter than adjacent rural areas. So this has major implications in the summertime, not only on our comfort, but on our health and our energy consumption. Another feature of cities that makes us really vulnerable to climate change is because we have so much impervious surface, we are really vulnerable to flooding. And this is actually a photo from Norwalk after Hurricane Ida, which happened over the summer. You all may remember. But you know, when it rains, when we get these heavy rain events, and as Andrea was mentioning, these really intense rain events, the water really has nowhere to go. And the environmental impacts it causes, not just flooding, but it can cause really severe environmental impacts because so many of our cities have combined sewer systems, which means that our rainwater and our sewage are being collected into one pipe. And under normal conditions, this is all going to go to a wastewater treatment, and it's going to get treated before it's discharged into a water body. But when we have these major rain events, the capacity of the wastewater exceeds the capacity of the sewer system. And so all of this sewage then is getting dumped into our waterways. So I want to highlight the fact that, you know, one thing we're talking about increasingly in urban areas is the fact that all of these impacts, these climate change impacts, are being felt really intensely amongst our vulnerable populations. And there's a lot of research right now that's sort of exploring these disparities in things like air temperatures and in income in cities. There was a recent national study conducted by the Nature Conservancy that looked at inequities in income, tree canopy cover, and temperature, and found, there's really significant differences in low income and high income neighborhoods, and that Connecticut actually has some of the worst disparities in income and tree canopy cover. And so, this is something we're thinking about a lot in urban forestry, that we're talking about all the time at CT Deep, because we recognize that these trees are such a valuable form of green infrastructure and so critical to combating climate change. And you can see one way that they do this is by reducing the urban heat island effect. So this is a map, this is satellite imagery of the greater Bridgeport area, and you can see it's showing you surface temperature and it's showing you tree canopy cover on the right side. So you can see this very clear and obvious correlation between areas that are really much warmer and that have much lower tree canopy cover. And that's sort of just deriving from satellite imagery and looking for correlations, but there have been a series of really awesome studies that have come out of Worcester, Massachusetts. Some of you may know Worcester, Massachusetts had a major emerald ash borer, a major Asian longhorn beetle outbreak, and their tree canopy in Worcester was almost 90% maples. So that meant that when that meant that they had major mortality in their trees, and it actually made for some really cool research opportunities where researchers could actually see, when we lose our tree canopy cover, how much of an increase do we see in temperature. These researchers found that a single tree removal can result in a 4 degrees Celsius increase in peak summer temperatures and 3 days longer of summer temperatures. So that's just one tree that's being lost, and that is having, an impact at a local scale. And the thing to keep in mind is that when we see these increased temperatures and we see that we're having, 3 days longer of summer temperatures, that then corresponds to increases in energy consumption. So they also found a 37% increase in energy consumption that was related to this widespread canopy loss. And you have to think about, sort of the synergies between these different impacts. When we're consuming more energy, we're emitting more CO2 into the atmosphere, we're increasing, the potential for climate change. So really, urban trees are such a critical piece of the puzzle when we're talking about mitigating the impacts. The last study I want to highlight here is, the previous studies are looking at satellite imagery to determine surface temperature. So that's the temperature on the ground. But in fact, when you're walking around, what you're really feeling is the ambient air temperature. So that's the temperature that's impacted by things like wind and by, topography and other landscape features. And so there's been some really incredible research coming out of the University of Concordia by a researcher, Dr. Zitter, who you can see here is on this bicycle. And she's mounted a temperature log onto her bicycle and is riding around the city and tracking changes in temperature and then relating this back to canopy cover. And in fact, we have a study that was done using the same equipment in New Haven, and we have some preliminary results that corroborate a lot of what Dr. Zitter found, which is that when we're talking about ambient air temperatures, we're seeing a non-linear relationship between canopy cover and heat reduction. So you can plant one tree, you can plant two trees, but you're not going to see significant changes in temperature until you reach a canopy cover of about 40%. And that's really important to keep in mind, especially when we think about that previous slide when Andrea was showing us different, land ownerships, landowners in Connecticut. If we want to achieve 40% canopy cover in our cities, we need to be thinking not just about street trees, we need to be thinking about trees in parks and trees on private property and in people's backyards. Now, trees also are really effective at mitigating stormwater runoff and also filtering water. So they filter water through their leaves as the rain comes down, and they take water up through their roots. But even just having trees in your landscape, you can see increased infiltration. So as rain water collects, it's able to move through the soil more slowly rather than this scenario where you can see we have mostly impervious cover, and most of that is going to result just in runoff. So there's been not as many urban heat island studies, but some studies that have explored the potential of trees to mitigate stormwater runoff and have found that increases in canopy cover from 12 to 40% can decrease stormwater runoff by about 2.6%, which again, these percentages might seem small, but when we think about the increases we're seeing in our in precipitation, these small percentages still matter. And the storage is not just happening in these trees, but it's also happening in the soil. So water storage in soil can be increased by, as this study found, 150 to 800%. One thing I want to highlight with all these studies is that the relative impact is really different. So they're finding that urban trees can absorb 20 to 60% of precipitation. 20% versus 60% is a huge difference. And that's because not all tree species have the same potential to perform these same services. And so that's also really critical to keep in mind when you're talking about a large statured oak tree versus, a small crabapple. The potential to take up stormwater, the potential to reduce things like urban heat island is really going to shift depending on what species of tree you're planting. So, we are planting a lot of trees in an effort to combat climate change, but I think what's important to keep in mind is that this strategy only works if those trees are going to be healthy and resilient despite all of the climate change impacts that we are observing. We know that changes in climate are going to influence, suitable habitat for some of our key species. So here you can see there's 4 maps here. This is from the U.S. Forest Service. I included the link here. It's a really fantastic link that shows you some potential species migrations and extinctions that we might see in our area. So this is a species importance values. It's just telling you sort of how important different species are on a scale from 0 to 100. And you can see things like chestnut oak, which currently are not super important here in Connecticut. They're indicated just by this lighter yellow, are predicted to increase with this increase in the green color that you can see. Whereas other species like sugar maple are really moving north and are not going to be as well suited to future climate scenarios. And so in an urban area where a lot of what we're doing is planting trees, we need to be thinking about the adaptability and suitability to future species when we're selecting what to plant. Trees are long-lived. And so when we're planting a tree, we're not just planting it for tomorrow, we're planting it for 100 years from now. So we want to consider which species are going to be adaptable and resilient for those future conditions. Again, this is another resource from the Forest Service that I encourage you to explore that outlines some of the different suitabilities of common species. Another thing we have to keep in mind when we're managing our urban forests for climate change is that invasive pests and diseases are threatening trees, and that is really being attenuated by climate change. This is hemlock woolly adelgid, and there's a lot of research coming out of the Connecticut Agricultural Experimental Station that shows that hemlock woolly adelgid only dies off when we get a certain number of cold days in the winter. And so with those reduced days in the winter, we see that the impact of things like hemlock woolly adelgid are really increasing. And that's where it becomes so critical for us to be thinking about species diversity. I mentioned that case in Worcester earlier where they lost almost 90% of their canopy because it had so many maples. And here you can see a beautiful ash-lined street pre and post emerald ash borer. So if we don't think about diversity in our tree plantings, we make ourselves really vulnerable to future pests and diseases that may come through. Andrea also highlighted drought in Connecticut, and we know that these periods of prolonged drought have major impacts on our trees, and especially on our urban trees. You have to keep in mind that urban trees are already under so much stress. They're already growing in suboptimal conditions in most cases. They're maybe growing along roadsides. with compacted soils where already it's really challenging for them to get all of the moisture that they need. And so when we're planting trees, we need to be thinking not just about planting them, but about watering them and making sure that when we plant them, we're giving them adequate space to access all of those resources that they need. So, recommendations are for new trees to be watered for at least the first 2 years of their life. Any tree planting program needs to incorporate some maintenance plan to be watering newly planted trees. And when we're planting trees, we need to make sure that the pits that we're planting them in are adequate size. So some cities have standards for how big street tree pits should be. In New York City, the expectation is that they're 5 feet by 10 feet, and that can be really hard to accomplish in a lot of our really urban areas. But thinking about things like adequate tree pit size, utilizing engineered soils where needed is a really important way for us to reduce the drought stress that our urban trees experience. The other real big challenge that we face is that with these increased intensity and frequency of storm events, we see major damage to a lot of our mature trees. And this is a problem not only because it damages our trees, but also because it really damages public perception of the urban forest. When people see trees come down and damage their private property, they're less inclined to want to plant trees on their property. They're less inclined to support tree planting programs. So planning for our urban forest and climate change means planning for, these storm events to increase in intensity. And unfortunately, in municipalities, which are, almost always underfunded, one of the first things that goes out the door is proactive pruning. So pruning trees, not only when they become a major hazard, but pruning trees throughout their life cycle so that their structural integrity is improved. So avoiding things like double leaders that down the road can cause to really massive problems once the trees become mature is a small step that we can take to prevent these issues in the future. And of course, maintaining trees through their life cycle means thinking about what's happening to trees once they die. Andrea, talked about the fact that carbon storage can be in timber products. And so in our urban areas, what we tend to do with most of our dead trees is we haul them out and they either get chipped or they get landfilled, where they're basically a net carbon loss. And they're also a monetary loss to the municipality. It's incredibly costly to transport trees and landfill them. And so here you see actually our first urban wood utilization program in Connecticut. This is in Hartford and Keeney Park. And we have a nonprofit that is working with youth in the area, employing them to actually mill and create useful lumber out of the trees that are harvested in Hartford. And the last piece I want to mention is that we tend to, in urban areas, get hyper-focused on trees along roadways and in street tree pits. But if you look at this aerial image of Hartford, what you can see is that actually, forested natural areas and parks comprise a really big percentage of our tree canopy cover. And so thinking about these areas in cities is a really critical way that we can, manage our urban forests and make sure that we can reach benchmarks like that 40% canopy cover that I mentioned before. And so this is a really good segue for me to pass it off to Andrea because she's going to be talking more about management in more woodland areas.
Thanks, Danica. And I know we've covered a lot of information thus far, most of which focused on the primary impacts of climate change on Connecticut forests, like changes in air temperature, precipitation, and extreme weather events. And then Danica spoke really well about what we can do to reduce those impacts of climate change in our urban landscape. I want to introduce some secondary threats to forest health that we're seeing in the wooded landscape that are derived from or linked to the primary impacts we introduced earlier. And I'll get into management as well. So One such secondary stressor is that of herbivory. Changes in snowfall and amounts and duration throughout the Northeast is expected to change the winter foraging behavior of herbivores like white-tailed deer, which is already a pretty major threat to our forest health by stunting and preventing adequate regeneration like you see depicted in this photo. Though it's still a bit unclear, climate change may benefit deer by providing them with easier access to forage and providing them with new species potentially to forage. There's been some cool studies that depict how deer, many of the hardwoods that are expected to expand their ranges northward are browsed much more heavily than some of our more northerly forested species. So that'll be an interesting dynamic to see play out over time. So this relationship is still a bit unclear, but it's worth paying homage to, considering the dynamic deers are playing influencing our landscape currently. Already a major issue in compromising forest health, invasive plants are disproportionately benefiting from climate change due to their broad environmental tolerances, extended leaf phenology, more effective exploitation of changed environments, and more aggressive colonization on new areas. These dynamics are being further exacerbated by disturbances, particularly extreme wind and precipitation events, as wind and water are two major ways in which plant seeds are distributed. Climatic factors that influence the ability of invasive plants to invade include those warmer temperatures, the longer growing season, and the reduced snowpack. So they are becoming even more competitive with tree and native plant regeneration and establishment. Moving forward through, in the context of management, controlling invasives should be an important consideration. This is particularly interesting as we may observe some southerly invasive species make their way into our region. Examples include some bush honeysuckles, some privets that we don't currently have, and that horrible vine, kudzu. So Danica mentioned pests and pathogens are becoming more damaging to the urban forest. This is true to our rural forested landscape as well. These pests and pathogens are able to adapt more quickly to suitable habitat and reproduce at faster rates than their host tree species. As we mentioned, insects and disease become more problematic when trees are already stressed by what I refer to as those primary stressors, such as drought. So here you're seeing an aerial image of Patchogue State Forest. All of the gray you're seeing, that haze in the forest canopy, is dead oak. This photo was taken in the summer. And this depicts the combined impact. Drought, lack of soil moisture prevented this native predator or natural predator of the gypsy moth. So there was nothing keeping the gypsy moth population in check. Those outbreaks further stressed the drought-stressed trees, and then the native two-line chestnut borer came in and really wiped them out. So big picture, what does all of this mean? It means that we're experiencing and will continue to experience a decline in our forest health. But it's not all doom and gloom, because forested systems are inherently resilient. And as Mike kind of mentioned in his introduction to this topic earlier, we have, as stewards, as lovers of the land, as people who need the forested system to live well and prosper, can do more to promote resilience. But what is a resilient forest? This is defined as a forest that can respond to a disturbance by resisting damage or stress and recovering quickly. Resilience fits in a spectrum of adaptive silviculture or adaptive forest management. It's one approach we as stewards can take to promote the adaptive abilities of our landscape. So alongside resilience is resistance on one end of the spectrum. And resistance is like kind of doing nothing, keeping the forest a forest, but maintaining current conditions of that forest. And having it be a forest is better in the fight against climate change than it not being a forest. Also, and then there's resilience, which is kind of like a happy medium. And then there's transition on the other end of this spectrum, where stewards, managers can promote a forest transition, an active change. So they're facilitating change, for example, by planting some of those species that are expected to either migrate north from the south or just do better here. As we move from the resistance end of the spectrum towards transition, the uncertainty in management approaches increases. So I've already kind of answered this question, but it's important to maintain and promote a resilient forested landscape across the urban to rural gradient because of the profound impact they have on our quality of life. It's selfish, but it's the truth of our reality. So what makes a forest adaptable? What makes it resilient? Here, though they look alike, you're seeing two different images, A and B. Take a second, look at these two images, note the differences, and think to yourself, which one do you think is more resilient than the other, if at all? I'll tell you the answer because we can't have a discussion over Zoom effectively, but the answer is B. Why? Simply because B is more structurally complex. And so by that, I mean the size, spacing, and arrangement of the live and dead vegetation is more complex, is more diverse than what you're seeing in A. Related to that, you're seeing a lot more deer browsing in A, which it's kind of like a positive feedback loop. They're more easily able to browse because of the lack of understory growth, but they're also contributing to a lack of understory growth because they're browsing everything. So things that can help promote structural complexity are gaps in the canopy, a maintenance of dead wood in addition to the live wood. And I'll talk more about how to promote B versus A. These three considerations are paramount when promoting resilience in a wooded landscape. The first consideration is forest composition. You need to assess what species comprise that forest because, as Danica mentioned, each tree species, whether it be planted along a street or growing in a state forest, each species has functional characteristics. Some have greater drought tolerances. They have specific regeneration strategies, specific disturbances, vulnerabilities or responses to disturbance, and they all kind of interact in a wooded landscape in their own way. So that's an important consideration. as I've already mentioned, we need to consider structure, the size and cohort of trees, the heterogeneity of the woodlot. Is structural complexity something that needs to be promoted or not? And then site conditions. Is promoting resiliency or adaptive abilities a priority based on the dynamics influenced by soil or disturbance vulnerabilities? Well, I'll briefly run through some examples of these considerations. Generally, the more shade tolerant a tree species, meaning, well, I think that's a pretty obvious thing, right? So I won't waste time, but the more shade tolerant a species, the less tolerant it is to drought. And so, without getting too much into silviculture, which is, how foresters manage our forests, there are certain silvicultural prescriptions that can, if you have a woodlot that is comprised mostly of shade tolerant species, some silvicultural prescriptions can promote the tolerance of that stand to drought, while others that foster shade tolerant conditions, regeneration of shade tolerant species, can reduce its tolerance. So this takes in consideration of vulnerabilities to drought or certain stressors and to species composition. Researchers have also found that unthinned, unmanaged stands tend to be more vulnerable to drought. And I'm focusing on drought here just because of its really profound impact on Connecticut's landscape recently. But this makes sense if you think about it. When trees grow in a wooded ecosystem, a forested ecosystem, they're really competing for available resources like sun, water, nutrients, space. So trees growing in this environment that are not thinned, whether it be through a natural disturbance or human intervention, have greater competition and therefore greater vulnerability to drought. So I'm just moving a little quickly here. I'm happy to answer more questions about these, but I want to look at this on a larger scale, not the stand level, but more either larger parcel or landscape level. So something we can do as foresters, as stewards, is vary the density of our standing trees throughout the parcel. This is a really kind of easy and interesting way to promote resilience. It does so because it creates these kind of micro habitats and climates and dynamics within the landscape. So it leaves, having larger patches with like a thinned matrix can leave some single trees, distributes mature habitat. It lowers that drought vulnerability. It lowers fire vulnerability. But those single trees remaining in that patch will have a higher vulnerability to wind. Having clumps of unharvested or thinned areas can serve as areas of refuge for wildlife. There would certainly be lower wind vulnerability in those areas, but greater drought vulnerability, and larger openings can increase and provide opportunities for species diversity, there's pollinator benefits associated with this. And it also provides opportunities if people wanted to do more facilitated adaptive management, they can. This is what that kind of, it's a blurry photo, but kind of what this looks like in reality. I'd want to see greater varied density. So, but here you're seeing kind of in the outskirts, you're seeing those single trees, and then you're seeing those openings. I just want to introduce that and want you to be aware of that there are projected changes in southern New England's habitat suitability for the region's tree species. So by 2100, we might expect to see less habitat suitable for the species listed in pink, and perhaps more habitat suitable for the species in the green, and then new habitats will become suitable for a whole suite of species not normally associated with our forests. There is debate in this dynamic of these new suitable habitats, but a lot of our modeled projections indicate this may occur. So to synthesize, to promote resiliency across our landscape, we should be promoting continuity of forest structure, function, and biota between pre and post, whether it be natural or human disturbances. And we should be promoting complexity of that forest structure, of species composition, and biological diversity. How do we do this? We control our invasive species. We consult a forester and develop a portfolio of management options, you know, that are in accordance with your goals as the landowner or steward. Some areas may be appropriate to make the active decision to not actively manage. So passive management may be appropriate, whereas timber harvests may be appropriate in other areas. So where timber harvest is appropriate, maintain overstory trees. And if you can time that maintenance with a masting year or, you know, during the to promote regeneration, that would be strategic and would behoove you. Retaining biological legacies, that's that continuity piece. That's where you keep overstory trees, live or dead, that were there before the disturbance with no plan to ever remove them. Retaining deadwood, both standing and downed, planting if necessary, and working with your foresters and operators to really exceed the best management practices for water quality. This is specific if there are streams or wetlands in your woodlot. Let's do our best to reduce herbivory. I know it's controversial, but the more hunters we have out there, the better. There's other ways we can reduce herbivory, creative ways like building slash walls with harvested materials. And then most simply, keep our forests and have a plan for your land, not just now, but post your time here on Earth. Okay, so this will create us long-term options in the face of uncertainty. It reduces vulnerability and provides our forests with multiple recovery pathways following the disturbance. So, in review, climate change is happening and it is reducing the health and function of trees and forests. Trees and forests mitigate climate change and they ameliorate its impacts. Those are two different things. Thoughtful management is needed across the urban to rural gradient to secure forest health and resilience. And effectively managing our landscape requires an understanding of forests along that urban to rural gradient and collaboration along that gradient. So with that, we'd like to thank you. We will start our video again and are happy to address whatever questions we have time for.
Okay, well, I will start with the questions. The first two questions that I have are related, so I'm going to read them both together for you, Danica and Andrea. The first, I'm miffed when I see neighbors cutting down their trees, most of them oaks. There seem to be two reasons. They're not aware of the importance of trees, and two, insurance companies are refusing to issue policies when trees seem dangerous to buildings. Can you comment on these two problems? And then, in addition to educational programs like tonight's programs, what can an organization do to promote awareness and to encourage homeowners to preserve their trees and properly to manage their yards? Okay.
It is working.
Okay, now we hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I do apologize. I assure you that we were trying to make everyone's life easier by presenting together. Okay, so two very good questions. I'm going to address them because I think these are questions that come up for me all the time in my role as the urban forestry coordinator. To address the second question first, I think one of the most powerful things that you can do to influence the way private landowners are stewarding their trees is by implementing a tree ordinance. We only have one municipality in the state of Connecticut that has a tree ordinance that extends onto private property. That's the city of Hartford. So if a landowner or a homeowner wants to remove a tree on their property, they need to get a consultation from the city forester in order to remove that tree. And something like an ordinance is just a really powerful way to impact the way homeowners are going to manage the trees on their property. The first question I think was more about it was about insurance, or
it was about homeowners feeling the need to cut down their trees, one, because they don't understand the importance of trees, and two, insurance companies really are afraid of the risk that the trees present.
I see. Yeah, and that's a challenging one. I mean, we have state statutes that extend into a lot of our public lands, and we have tree wardens that are tasked with the care and maintenance of trees on our public lands and our municipalities. But when we're talking about trees on private property, that really is up to the landowner. And so I'm not sure what the best approach is. I know that in a lot of cities, like the city of New Haven, there's nonprofits like the Urban Resources Initiative that do a lot of outreach, actually door-to-door knocking in communities to kind of speak to the benefits of urban trees and to provide resources to homeowners. And that has been very successful, but it's a big investment. And I know not every municipality has the capacity to carry out a program like that, but that sort of one-on-one FaceTime, I think, is really critical for making those connections.
Great, thanks. Next question. What role does species diversity, tree and otherwise, play in our forest's ability to mitigate climate change?
Okay, so is this question about the different rates of carbon storage in different tree species? Is that
Mike, you want to respond to that?
Danica, I was speaking in general terms. Does species diversity give us safeguards as far as threats to tree species and how other organisms within the forest ecosystem contribute through their diversity to the health of our trees?
Yes, absolutely. So yes, I mean, I think species diversity, taxonomic diversity is the best safeguard that we have against things like invasive pests and against, Andrea and I presented on lots of expected species migrations and extinctions based on climate change, but these are all models and these are not things that are certain. And so we don't know which species will do well and which won't in the wake of climate change. And so the best way to hedge our bets is by making sure that we have a diverse forest. It's also important to think about not only taxonomic diversity, so diversity by genus and by species, but functional diversity as well. So having a mixture of deciduous and evergreen trees, having a mixture of, in our urban forests, of large statured and small statured ornamental trees, thinking about the way different tree species function on the landscape is also really crucial to securing, the ability to mitigate climate change.
Great, thanks. Next question. What forest management methods promote wildlife, in particular, a diversity of bird species? We're not hearing you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, now we do. No.
Okay, I'm back, right? I'm back. Okay,
Yep.
Great question. There's a lot we can do in terms of forest management to increase the diversity of our bird populations, particularly of the dirty dozen birds, species that have been identified by Audubon as those either diminishing, declining in population, or at greatest risk of decline due to mostly habitat loss. These species tend to require early successional habitats, so younger forests than what younger forests and relative to what we have on average across Connecticut's landscape. Our forests are about 80 to 120 years of age, and many birds require, and reptiles and small mammals require larger swaths of forests that are really between like 0 or let's say 5 and like 30 years of age. And those are currently underrepresented in our landscape. So it's a silvicultural clear cut, which is where you remove a large swath of overstory trees, leaving some residual standing trees as structural elements, seed sources, etc. But those are what are most commonly employed to promote not just wildlife diversity, but plant diversity as well. Because different plants establish first, usually, more berry producing plants, shade intolerant tree species before they transition to shade tolerant. But there's also this whole world of research out there throughout the Northeast. It has a different name in each state, but they all are something like forestry for the birds, silviculture with birds in mind, something like that. And that is where foresters work to promote the 6 structural attributes in a forest that would cover kind of all the bases for birds, 3 of which are considered green, so addressing live vegetation, and 3 of which are brown, addressing dead vegetation, again, emphasizing the importance of dead wood on the landscape. So there's a lot of things we can do through forest management to promote, the health and vigor of overstory trees, to promote a productive and functional understory or mid-story, and to promote a functional and healthy native population of ground cover. For deadwood, it's a leaf litter and it's coarse woody materials, so downed dead trees of different decay classes, of different sizes, and standing dead trees. So there's a lot we can do in management beyond just silvicultural clear cuts and larger gaps to foster diversity in this way. But those are the elements that we strive to promote.
Thank you. Well, we've got 2 more questions and we've got 4 more minutes. So let's see if we can finish off these last 2 questions in 4 minutes. Is there any research that shows the resistance to climate change by native shrubs and trees as compared with invasive species?
That's a really great question. I don't know. I mean, relative to trees, at least, there are fewer non-native invasive trees in a wooded landscape than there are in an urban landscape. Commonly, I'll see maybe some Norway maple. Some folks consider black locust to be invasive. And I don't know anything about a comparison between those ability to be resilient to climate change or contribute to offsetting the impacts relative to our native species. I do know that a lot of our invasive plants or shrubs do not provide as much nutritional value to wildlife and are kind of playing a role in that dynamic. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is to actually come back to Michael's question about diversity as a way of securing, resilience to climate change, because one of the reasons that invasive species are such a threat is because they form these monocultures. And that's especially true with shrubs. So, I do a lot of work in urban areas. We have major issues in a lot of our natural areas with burning bush, which will just form big, huge stands. It's really shade tolerant. It limits a lot of regeneration. And when you're just growing a pure stand of burning bush, not only are you limiting carbon storage because it's a shrub versus a tree, but you're also limiting diversity. So let's say something comes through that decimates burning bush, we're then, losing all of those species. So I think, the potential is for them to form monocultures and to also, as Andrea mentioned, carbon storage is not just in the above ground biomass, but it's happening in the roots and in the soil. We have soil microbes that have very well established relationships with a lot of our native tree species. And so when we have invasive trees and shrubs come in, they're actually changing the soil dynamics as well. So they're probably impacting carbon storage in our soils as well. So that's a lesser studied aspect, but it's a great question to bring up because it certainly plays a role.
Great. Okay, let's see if we can squeeze in two more questions in 1 minute. How often does DEEP receive requests from towns for strategies to make forest areas healthier? Oh, we're not hearing you.
Okay, there goes our minute. Okay, well, I would just say maybe not often enough. I'll have stuff to Andrea because she gets a lot of those requests from municipalities, but I think probably we both feel not often enough. We love to work with our municipalities.
Yes, in my short tenure with the state of only 3 and almost a half years, I've only gotten 2 or 3 requests from municipalities. Many more homeowners with yard trees that they want to cut down and sell, which is not, which is not the same thing. So,
okay. That answers the question. And I'm going to sneak in this last one. How do you protect soil mycorrhizal health with clear cuts?
Okay. How do you protect mycorrhizal health during a silvicultural clear cut? Well, that's a great question. And one thing to keep in mind that when a silvicultural clear cut is conducted, even though overstory trees are removed, we're not removing roots or the other vegetation covering the forest floor. And very rapidly, it's amazing how quickly things grow back in a silvicultural clear cut. obviously not the overstory trees, but seedlings, saplings, shrubs, herbaceous plants. And so, to my understanding, as long as considerations are put in place where the clear cut is being conducted in an appropriate season, it's one reason why we foresters try to conduct harvests in the winter or frozen soil conditions or very dry soil conditions. That's like probably the primary thing we do. There are some best management practices and standards in the industry that are implemented to reduce negative initial impacts of the harvest. But to my understanding, there is not a significant negative impact on the below ground mycorrhizal community and soil health as a result of a silvicultural clear cut, in part because of the timing of it and in part because of the rapid growth that ensues following.
Great. Thank you very much. So this ends the Q&A, and I'll pass it back to you, Mike.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for attending tonight. I want to say thank you very much to our presenters, Danica and Andrea. You exceeded my expectations. I knew I was knocking on the right doors in having you present for us. I've read your research, and once again, you exceeded my expectations.